Good afternoon, everyone. We've just had a quick shot of coffee and we're back with you. So thank you for staying online and just looking at these poll results again. The first question was, investors over the age of 65 are more likely to engage in socially responsible investing than all other ages, true or false? And we still had a predominantly false answer. Actually, one of the interesting findings of that study that was just presented was that it is that age group that's doing the most SRI investing. The second question was, what is the biggest issue around ESG investing? And there was only two answers that really got a lot of response, and these were ESG ratings are not highly correlated and ESG investing methods are not standardized. So that leads us really nicely actually into our next speaker. So Florian Berg is an academic, a postdoctoral research fellow at MIT. So we have an Ivy League researcher with us today. And he's actually written a series of papers around the issues with ESG ratings, not all telling you the same thing, and has also actually, in his most recent paper, shown a way that we can move past that and find maybe what is the underlying ESG performance that those different ratings tell us together. So without anything else, Florian, thank you for your time, really appreciate it. And we look forward to hearing what you've got to say.
Hey, thanks, Sebastian. That was a great introduction. Thank you so much. I would like to share actually now my screen, if that's okay.
Please do.
Okay, and you can hear me perfectly, right?
Yeah, sounds great.
Cool. Great. Okay. So, as Sebastian said, I am currently working at MIT Sloan. And what I'm presenting now is joint work with Julian Kolbe from University of Zurich and Roberto Rigobon here from MIT as well. And so I've been doing research in sustainable investing for a while. I started my PhD 10 years ago, 12 years ago. And I was looking at this link between financial performance and social performance, ESG performance. And it was really fascinating how at the time everyone was complaining about the data, but and me included, but no one was really doing research about the data. And I think that, so over the time that there's still, I think, too little research done on actually the data itself, and but a lot on this link between financial performance and ESG performance. And we set out to change that. In our paper that we call Aggregate Confusion, the Divergence of ESG ratings. Aggregate confusion was because when we started downloading all this data, so the ESG rating and with the raw data, we were very confused because there was so much aggregation going on. And so this became the working title and then also the final title of the paper. But let's just dive in. So as I said, ESG ratings diverge. According to the poll, nothing new to you. I'm just showing that very briefly here, that on the left, that this diversion is also very, very, there's a lot of heterogeneity in this divergence, as you can see. So this is the same sample. Here we have 924 firms in our sample and 6 raters. And what you see is on the left, those firms where they raters agree the most. And then on the right is those where they disagree the most. And the rating is normalized. And as you can see, for those where there's a lot of divergence, there's up to 4 standard deviation difference sometimes between 2 raters, which is obviously massive. So this is a little bit to look at what's going on inside the distribution. And here I'm showing you the correlations. And they're also very low between Asset 4, Rebecca Sam, Sustainalytics, and Vigio Iris. So Rebecca Sam is S&P Global nowadays. Sustainalytics belongs to Morningstar, Asset 4 is near now Refinitiv. Vigio Iris is Moody's ESG solutions, and you have MSCI and KLD spaced out. But what you see is that they're roughly between 40 and 75%, the correlations, especially Asset 4, Robeco Sustainalytics, and Vigio Iris seem to be in a kind of same correlate, close to each other in this correlation space, and where the correlation is around between 60 and 70. So we, at the time when we started the paper, we realized that there's a lot of divergence, and so we wanted to explain that. And the way we did it is that we actually defined, that we defined first theoretically that the divergence can come from three sources. That is scope. So what do you actually include in your assessment? So most of those ESG raters, they have up between 40 and 280 different sub-indicators that are then aggregated to one ESG score. So the question is, what do I actually include? And this, obviously there are cultural differences, but there are also personal differences within a culture. So once you answer that question, if you, for example, measure CO2 emissions, or you measure child labor or human rights issues, then you actually have to see what the relative importance between them is. So what is more important to you? Is it diversity issues or climate change? So we're talking about the weight between those indicators. And the last source of divergence is measurement. Measurement is more complicated because the first two sources was kind of how I define, how I conceptualize sustainability. But the other part is actually about measurement divergence. And measurement divergence hints that there's also measurement noise, that we actually do not measure things correctly. And it would be really surprising if we did, because I mean, those are very complex things that we try to measure. And if you can't even measure GDP noise-free, which should be fairly easy compared to a lot of those things we look at here in the sustainability space, then ESG measurement should also be noisy. Our key findings are that actually roughly half of the divergence is coming from this, what I call the definition of sustainability, so your values. So what do I measure and what the relative importance, and the other half is measurement divergence. But let's dig a little bit deeper into the data set, because that's actually quite interesting. First, here, the number of indicators. As I said, the ESG scores have, or the ESG rating agencies have completely different, they have completely different levels of raw data, or look at complete different set of issues often. And it goes from 38 for Vigio Iris Moody's to 282 for Refinitiv Asset 4. So, as I said, we then actually, in order to make those ESG raters, so in order we can actually use them and look at the divergence, we created a taxonomy, or differently said, we actually created a common language. We had to match the indicators, and so we created a common language, and by that we created 64 categories that at least have observations or indicators from it, 2 rating agencies, sometimes even up to 6, all rating agencies. But and then we have a lot of also unclassified indicators that are very particular and very special to just because only one rater looks at that issue. So once I have this categorization, I can actually then just calculate very simply the correlations. I talked about 64 categories. Here it's only 26. It's SASB. I use SASB here because it's just easier to see and you kind of get a grasp of what's going on. We used SASB as a robustness check in our paper. And so, if you're interested in how we approached it with our categorization, then I invite you to read the paper. But look at this. This is a heat map of the correlations between different raters for each category. And the correlations are all over the place. The highest seem between KLD and MSCI for almost everything, which makes absolutely sense because KLD is just also is from MSCI. It's a legacy rating because it was used heavily in academia. So they kept it going, but it was basically just a mapping on some parts of the MSCI data. So it makes sense that the correlations are high. But when you look at, they'll also see those red fields at the bottom, right? For selling practices and product labeling, minus 50%. That is, so one KLD says, this is a great company in terms of responsible marketing, and Sustainalytics say, no, this is literally the worst part company in terms of responsible marketing. And so this is really surprising that those correlations have such a wide range for something. And you can see here already there's measurement error. We also looked at, for example, like indicators that should be completely unambiguous, such as the signing the UN Global Compact. And even there were like only correlations of 92%, which is crazy because it's something you can just look up in the database. So I look for temporal effects because maybe companies signed and one rate have already had that in the data, the others not. But actually, there was really, they got it wrong actually for a lot of companies. And so you see there's measurement error. We also see white blank fields. That means that hints that there's also scope divergence, measurement divergence and scope divergence. So now in order to test actually if our methodology, if our taxonomy, this common language is actually a valid construct and we can use it, we figure out if we look at or if we insert the data, the indicators from each rater and look at it through our categorization and are able to explain fully their own ESG rating. So we do a kind of reverse engineering and we do that well. So then we know that actually our taxonomy is good. And we just run simple regressions. So we run here regressions of Sustainalytics, for example, in the first column on their own data, but through the lens of our categorization. And we see that down there, the R squared, which shows how much variance we explain in that regression, is at 87%. And it's very high for the others. So we see that this is actually a fairly good assumption. For those who study econometrics or machine learning, they know like regression is fundamentally linear. That means we do not make any difference between the weights between industries. We built in a model where we did that as well, but it didn't perform much better. So that shows us that actually a linear approximation, the way we did it, so no different weights, nothing conditional on sectors, no different weights between sectors, is actually a good approximation. That's also a very interesting result. But now we see here that there's also weight divergence because as you see, the coefficients are also different between raters. So now we saw scope divergence, weight divergence, and measurement divergence. And here are the results. So again, there's a slight, we also have a different way of disentangling the data. So in our papers, a second way of disentangling it, and that shows a little bit more, that measurement comes a little bit stronger out. But this is roughly what our model gives. In our model, you can use actually very easily to explain now what the difference between two raters is for one given company. Let's say Berg Gold here as an example between Refinitiv, S4, and KLD. I can explain now the divergence with the categories. So the overall divergence is the red bars, that's 1.5 standard, 1.6 standard deviations in total. And the green bars is scope divergence, the blue bars is measurement divergence, and the pink bars are weight divergence. And we see, for example, the biggest blue bar is remuneration. So means that a substantial amount of this divergence between, so the different assessments between asset 4 and KLD comes from the fact that both raters measure remuneration differently. And so hence they come to different conclusions. And the same is here for weight divergence. There are different weights, for example, on toxic spills, on biodiversity, community and society, all very important topics for a mining corporation, of course. So let me just briefly show, this is our first paper, the aggregate confusion paper, but we also have a second paper, because what I actually already said is that 50% of the divergence roughly is from measurement divergence. And so measurement divergence means hints measurement noise, that we do not measure correctly. We want to try to measure the same thing, but we can't. And so this measurement noise, actually, we suggest a correction procedure for that econometrically. And we find something very surprising, or actually not surprising if you think in terms of noise, but surprising because that no one has ever actually thought about it in the literature. The fact that the link between financial performance, when you analyze financial performance and ESG performance, you calculate, you run a regression or a correlation, this is actually downward biased, this correlation, because of the noise in the ESG. When we correct for that, we actually find that those coefficients, so the link goes up by more than double. So the link, so if ESG has an outperformance or an underperformance, I do not really want to get into that discussion here, but it doesn't matter. Each way, the correlation is underreported in terms of absolute values. Yeah, and so we just suggest what we call an instrumental variable approach, which is normally used also, for example, I talked about GDP. So this kind of approach is used also for GDP in the econometric literature. So we just applied that to ESG ratings, and we have a lengthy discussion in our paper why you can do that, and and run a million simulations about that the tests are powerful. But here, let me just talk about the results before I get lost in the details. We have here in our data set, we have 8 raters, and we show that the coefficient, they change quite a lot. And especially for raters that you would think already that are noisy. For example, TVL, True Value Labs, is very much, has a daily variation because they're very much focused on controversies on media reports. So this is the advantages that you have a fast reacting ESG score. But the disadvantages, of course, those media reports are very noisy, especially just when you look at with an NLP. And so we find with our noise correction procedure that actually, yes, the coefficients, the noise corrected coefficients go up massively. So this link, this correlation is much stronger. What we also find is that it's not necessarily, and this is actually all the blue bars means, so in 20 out of 24 cases, we find actually that our noise correction increases this link. So that's really strong findings. And what we also find is that the way we correct for the noise is that we basically say that we try to explain one rating with the other 7 ratings, and because here we have 8 in our data set. And so using the variability that is in the other 7 raters, that actually we declare, or we say this is the true ESG performance, or the not noisy ESG performance. So now we have this one rating that is explained. And what we find is actually, so since we need a combination of more than one rater to denoise, we find that raters that are fairly different in the data generating process, such as, for example, S&P Global versus TVL, they are very good in order to reduce the noise. So rather than buying twice the same, or two two data sets with the same kind of ideology and the same way of generating data, it would be better to buy two different data sets, or even 3 or 4. Yeah. So Sebastian, how much more time do you have? All right.
You've got about, where are we? Probably 3 more minutes before, if we want to have some question time.
Okay, cool, great. So if not, I would have a little bit. I can answer more questions about this. But let me talk about the implications for investors. So I think what we see here is that ESG rating, there's a reason why they diverge. Half of the divergence is actually just different values, and everyone is entitled to their own values. So in that sense, ESG ratings will never really converge, because also those preferences, they change, the values change over time. So if I write down my values today or next week, they will most likely be different. And the other part is more problematic, this measurement noise, as I showed. We showed a way how to correct for that, but obviously this is only one way. So you can use mathematical tools to reduce the noise. But in the long run, we have to also work on improving the measurement. And to do so, we should actually, I think we need to ask the regulators to regulate about ESG ratings agencies, because for me, even as a researcher, it was very hard to actually really understand the methodologies. So we need to force them to be more transparent in order to increase the competition between them. Because if they're more transparent, then actually investors, academics or NGOs, or even the media can criticize them. And through that, we might actually increase the competition and spur more innovation. I think this is very important. Then I saw in the poll, what I want to quickly say was that a lot of people say that those methodologies, the ESG rating methodologies, should be standardized. But the problem is, as we showed, first, some is just values, right? One part. But the other part is actually measurement noise. And measurement noise means you do not know exactly how to measure things. And that actually means you cannot standardize it, because if you standardize it, then for sure everyone has the same information. But it's not good information, and we will completely stall any innovation and any effort to make it better. And I think this is actually really the big challenge of the future, that the measurement gets better. And so, I'm very much against such a standardization of ESG rating methodology. Thank you for listening, and I'm very happy to take your questions. Also, if you have any questions, if you want to know anything, just send me a mail. You'll find it on the MIT website, or Sebastian will may just forward or introduce us. And I'm happy to answer everything. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Florian. Really interesting work. And just to sort of give some summary points from my end, as I haven't seen any questions yet, is, there's this issue around ESG ratings not telling us the same information, which, most of you already knew through the poll results. But that difference is actually somewhat good. And if you incorporated 2 or more ESG providers that are actually using quite different techniques, that can actually create a benefit. And something, Florian, that I think you didn't highlight enough, or maybe it's something you didn't want to, is that actually once you use this correction procedure that you've developed, right, to cancel out some of the noise, that relationship between ESG performance and financial performance actually becomes more positive. That's what I read in your paper. So I think
more than doubles. So that is actually very big. And what we also, what I didn't say, because it was just a time issue, but we show that actually when you use our noise correction procedure, that the rankings completely change. If you, let's say, only want to create a leader portfolio, ESG leader portfolio with, let's say, 100 firms in there, then if you use our noise procedure corrector, then you would only 20 out of those 100 would be the same.
Yeah, fascinating. So I think some really interesting potential solutions. And I would also agree with your call for more regulation around transparency, but not around standardization, because then we might just have a standard that's wrong or has a lot of noise, as you say, that everyone follows and thinks they're doing the right thing whereas they're not. So again, thank you for your time, Florian. I think we're catching up in a couple of days anyway. So yeah, thank you very much. I'm sure this is very valuable for everyone. Oh, we have one question.
Great.
Which came through from John Berry. He's actually a sustainable investment fund manager here in New Zealand. Slightly off topic, but can Florian please talk a little on his awesome work around investor impact versus company impact?
Oh, yeah, I can, but this is actually not me. This is Florian Heep, which is a very good friend. I'm working with him on a paper, but he actually wrote a paper about can sustainable investing save the world, and he looks at investor impact versus company impact. Yeah, I think we actually talk about this in our paper, and as I said, I didn't want to get into the whole theoretical discussion about if there's a positive coefficient or a negative coefficient between financial performance, so negative or positive link between ESG performance and financial performance. But what I can say is that, yeah, I think we need, we haven't really figured out if buying, what actually really the mechanisms are, or how much we actually change the world by buying ESG funds. Because that's in the end what we want to do, right? We want, if I as an investor, if I buy an ESG fund, I want that the world changes a little bit in a positive way, according to my values. But so far, I haven't seen compelling proof academically that there is actually an impact. And the impact channel would be you buy a stock, you drive up the price because it's just a preference. And by that, the problem is by that, you might actually have a lower expected return, so a lower future return, but you lower the cost of capital of that firm. And with that lower cost of capital, they can refinance themselves more easily and do more of what they already do. So maybe you do more good in the world. That would be a typical way, but I haven't really seen that really disentangled that impact, that transmission channel.
Yeah, I think that, and we talked about this a little bit earlier in the day when you weren't here, there was, there's this idea that ESG investing will create impact through that channel that you're talking about, but that's quite a long chain reaction to try and prove or show. Whereas, that we might be investing in companies in the secondary market that have company impact, but that doesn't mean your investment is necessarily changing anything unless, you can show that our collective investment has increased the stock price, therefore lowered the cost of capital, therefore they've now done more of that activity, right? So I think this definition between company impact and portfolio impact is really important. And it's why I see, at least at this stage, when we haven't been able to disentangle that, impact investing is really for the world of primary market investment or primary transaction.
I agree, Sebastian, I totally agree. I would say there's one thing that you can do as a mutual fund where I believe that this could lead to impact is if you vote a lot in favor of ESG within the general assemblies.
Yeah, very strong engagement
proposals. That channel, that would be a direct channel. But when we look at, for example, the big one, the BlackRock, they started that actually very, very recently. This kind of voting behavior. So yeah, and the problem is then again, change in the short run might actually lead to a cost, right? So I'm not saying that's necessarily the case, but it's also not necessarily a win-win situation. And that is something we still, we still have to figure out.
Awesome. Thank you for your thoughts on that as well. And we'll let you go, or maybe you want to watch the couple of presentations we've got left for the day.